Hello, I'm Anna Inacacho, your host for today's show.
I'm Jeremiah, co-host.
Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the topic of media bias and how it affects our perspectives on race. So, what even is media bias? Well, for example, media bias is when you, let's say, watch the news. And have you ever thought and listened to a news story and thought it sounded a little too one-sided, or that it left a big chunk of the story out? If you ever felt like this is an example of media bias. And media bias has a really big impact on our public perception. According to study.com, the definition of media bias is the perception that the media is reporting the news in a partial or prejudiced manner. Now, media bias is not only found in the news, but it's found in all different types of media, such as ads, social media, TV shows, cartoons, and even sports media. Today, we're going to be talking about how this thing called media bias actually has a big effect on our perspectives on race. Now, you may be thinking, how does media bias and race have anything to do with each other? Well, that's what we're going to be discussing about today in our 30-minute discussion, which is shortened due to you guys' feedback. So if you guys have any more feedback, feel free to reach out to us. But we're going to be having an amazing 30-minute discussion on how media bias actually has a big effect on people of color because of the high amounts of bias and stereotypical portrayals of POC in the media. So we have our co-host here, Jeremiah Cox, which will start off our amazing discussion.
Yeah, thank you for teeing us off, Ed. And I think that media bias is a hugely important topic that we don't really give enough attention to because a lot of the places that draw our attention to topics relating to racism are very skewed and biased in their own rights. And it's really hard to escape our media bias. So instead, what we're trying to do today is find ways to bring awareness to it so that we can really understand how it impacts us and what we can do to kind of undo our media bias in a sense, or even just by making ourselves aware of it, try to not let the bias that the media has impact our everyday actions and assumptions about people around us. And something that's really interesting for me is to go back to the history of how we got here. Way back in the day when America had still not had a constitution and we were still in massive slave times, the largest held assumption among white Americans was that Black people were docile, simple creatures, and they needed to be taken care of. And that's one of the ways that slavery was justified for so many years. But as soon as the Civil War ended and slavery was officially disbanded, there needed to be a new narrative. And so there was a very intentional effort to create a narrative around Black people being difficult and needing to be tamed and kept under control. And this was a way to justify Jim Crow and extreme police brutality. And this is a very similar narrative to what we see today. When we hear stories about Black people who have committed a crime or about white people who have committed a crime, then we hear very different skewed perspectives and information about both people. Let's say that two people have committed the same exact crime and one's Black, one's white, or one is Latin and one is white. We will hear that the white person had a family, that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, that they have made one bad decision and they have decided to change their life and they're going to stop committing crimes forever. But then when we see someone who is not white, who has committed the same exact crime, we'll more often not hear that they had a criminal history. We'll hear about all of the bad things in their lives. We'll hear that we'll see a poor quality photo of them. We'll see their mugshot instead of a picture of them with their families. And all of these images are subliminally affecting us, and they affect how we see other people of that same racial group. They'll influence a jury, they'll influence law enforcement, they'll influence the people who are creating and writing these laws. One famous example of this, where the media's portrayal of a criminal defendant was intentionally skewed to impact public perception, was when O.J. Simpson was having his famous trial. And his face was shown on the cover of Time magazine. And eventually it was disclosed that Time darkened his skin color to make him look more intimidating. And this has a proven impact on the world and on our perception of people. And in fact, police brutality towards African-American men has been proven to increase based on the negative coverage that they receive in media. And I find this just to be fascinating and horrifying that we can keep allowing this to happen. But Adonai, what are your thoughts on this? Why do you think that this keeps happening? And how do you think this impacts us? Why is it so important to talk about?
I feel that it's really, really important to talk about racial bias in media, especially because I feel that television, especially now with technology improving these days and knowing that technology is going to be our future, that media really does have a big impact on how we view the world. And so it's really important that what we're getting from the media is correct. And the truth is it's not, right? And media bias is the reason why we have these racial stereotypes, is the many reasons why we do. And I definitely agree what we're talking about when we talk about criminal cases in media and in news, and when talking about images, right, and how they perceive and show people of color in the media simply by just one single image without even saying any words. We start making these unconscious categories, right, of different races and what we view them as, right, and making these perspectives unconsciously. And even when they do speak, they do use specific labels, right, to label those people as those criminals and people being accused of crimes, right? And one statistic shows that media coverage was 50% more likely to refer to white defendants by their name as compared to a Black defendant. Now, you may think that that does not have a big impact on, let's say, the news and how they tell the story, right? But this is another trick of media bias and unconscious bias, right? Because let's say if I were to call you man with the blue shirt every time I saw you, right? Man with the blue shirt, can I have some help? Right? You wouldn't feel that connection with me, right? But if I called you, hey, Jeremiah, can you come help me? You'd feel that connection with each other, right? So we can see through the news that if they're 50% more likely to be called by name, we feel a connection to them, like a human connection. But as we can see, as Leslie can pull up now, an infographic of what they are called when talked about in media, we see that the white defendants are called by, let's say, their name, or father, son, man. So we have this human to human connection that we naturally feel inside of us. But when talking about Black defendants, let's say, or people of color who have been accused of a crime, we use strong words like murder, arrested, accused, and even you can see numbers on the screen, right? So labeling us as our age, right? And this kind of does not give that connection as we're talking about earlier with the man with the blue shirt. We're not having this connection when we use those words. So even labels have a big impact on how we perceive media personally. So I want to ask you, how do you feel images and even just what people say in media affect what we think about others?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, I mean, it's dehumanizing when you call someone, when you identify them based on their demographics or what they're wearing, or it's absolutely dehumanizing, and it's an intentional way to make it so that we empathize with one person, whereas we don't empathize with another person. When we see two people commit the same crime, and we call one a father of two and the other person a 36-year-old Black man, we're obviously going to empathize with the father versus the age, and then that accrues and generally and accumulates over our lifetime when we hear that type of imaging so frequently, so that we eventually just assume that when we see a Black man and a white man, we assume that the white man is going to be a father figure and a caring person, whereas the Black man is going to be this dangerous, man who's going to have a proclivity to crime and be less desirable to be around, when of course all these assumptions are completely false. And one case that I feel like manifests this type of disparity in how a story is presented can impact how it's perceived was when Nathan Phillips a few years ago was harassed by white teenagers in DC. When Phillips, who is an indigenous activist and artist, was in Washington, DC to protest. I don't exactly remember what he was protesting at that time, but it drew a lot of media attention and went viral almost immediately, because in the midst of him and his indigenous group of people singing and dancing and protesting whatever was happening at that time, a group of white teenagers and well, predominantly white. There were a few teenagers of color there as well, but almost all of them were wearing MAGA hats, and they were standing up to these indigenous protesters and mocking them, making taunts. And one kid in particular stood up right in front of Nathan Phillips. And Leslie, you can show the image. I'm sure that you've seen this image, and it strikes a bell from a few years ago because it was on every social media platform, and got news coverage, was famous for quite a while. But essentially, this white kid was just completely disregarding Nathan Phillips's activism and pain, and was just mocking and disrespectful. And this drew a lot of controversy at first because the kid was being seen as this insensitive, relatively racist person who was making a big stir. And so the white kid got a lot of negative press, and Nathan Phillips gained a lot of sympathy at first. But then over the next couple of days, the coverage started to change, and the perception of both of these people started to really shift drastically. And one example of this that I think really illustrates how coverage can change how we perceive a story is in the Today Show. Both Nathan Phillips and this white kid were interviewed on the Today Show, and they were presented extremely differently. Leslie, if you'll show the image of the Kentucky student, we can see that, I mean, to me, this almost looks like a completely different kid. I mean, he has like a makeup job that was done to make him look a little bit younger and his skin to look softer. He's wearing clothes that are like a size too big. I mean, he looks 12 years old. And there are all these little details that impact how he looks that way. That in the original video, he looked, 16, 17, a similar stature to Nathan Phillips. But in this shot, he looks tiny. He looks innocent. The camera angle is shot from above his eye level, so it makes him look smaller than he really is. And during the clip, we can't see it here, but the interviewer spoke with this student face to face in a genuine, concerned way, so that it wasn't just like an impersonal cut with both of them on the screen on opposite sides of the screen. And all of these things amounted to making this kid look sweet, innocent, and like he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it made us feel sorry for him, because he went on to tell a sob story of how all of this negative press had hurt his life and made it so difficult for him to go to school and to apply to colleges and all these sorts of things. And then later on, when we saw Nathan Phillips be interviewed a couple of days later, Leslie, we can show that picture now. He wasn't really dressed up at all. The interviewer wasn't being very personable with him. It was a cut scene. So there was Nathan Phillips in one box and the interviewer in the other box. And honestly, I mean, it made Phillips look bad. His microphone was kind of folded over his shirt. You could see all the wires. There wasn't a very strong effort to present Nathan Phillips in a positive light. And it was very obvious that they weren't putting nearly as much effort into this interviewer's appearance as they were with the other white kid. And there was a ton of content that was released and slew in the light of this controversy. But what was covered and what received airtime is what influences people's opinions. So when they were talking about the white student, we were hearing that they had a right to be there. They weren't being violent. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was their first time ever acting up. And we heard all about how horribly this whole controversy was affecting them. Whereas when we heard about Nathan Phillips, we heard about his criminal history. We heard about how everything that he had done, we heard of everything that was wrong with him, how he claimed to be a vet, but he actually wasn't, how he didn't have a right to be there, how he didn't file the right paperwork to have a proper protest. And we heard everything that made him look like he was in the wrong, and the white kid was just, practicing his rights of standing and minding his own business. What we didn't hear was Nathan Phillips's history of generational trauma of being an Indigenous man in America, and how we have consistently erased Indigenous cultures and histories and activism and voices. And this whole presentation was able to spin the story to the point where Nathan Phillips got ignored, and this white kid could restore his name and has since become a prominent voice for conservative America, and has had multiple interviews ever since, even just commenting on politics. It's amazing to me how how much we can believe, or how much we can have our opinions shifted by the way that a story is spun, and by the way that the details that are provided, the context that's given, and the context that's not given as well. Adonai, what do you think about this story? How does this relate to other things that you've heard, and what do you think plays all this? How does this impact us in our daily lives as well?
I personally think that this story is just one of those other stories that happen honestly daily when it comes to reporting news story, and even just police brutality and etc. And actually recently, one of my friends from my neighborhood and dealt with an incident with the police, and it all goes like this, right? Where there's a black man and his white friend, and obviously the black man is getting accused for the same thing that the white man did. And I feel like that's the story, that's the repetitive story that's completely shown on media. And as we talked about, like criminal cases in media, and it doesn't even have to be a criminal case, but they want to put us in this category of a criminal, right? And using those labels and media, like media imagery, to not explicitly tell us that this specific group is bad, or this specific group was just at the wrong place at the wrong time, like you said. But they use these details to really shun us and like people of color in general. I feel like it's something that happens in our daily lives, and even it doesn't even have to be being accused by the police. I feel that when it comes to just even education and schools, right, we're automatically accused first, or even if we didn't do something bad, we're always put into that spotlight as if we are the bad guy, even though it's not explicitly shown, right? And sometimes I feel the pressure that, oh, if I do this, then I'm gonna look like the bad guy, even though what I may be doing is not necessarily bad. That's why our parents always have these conversations with us on what not to do and what to do. And we may think personally for us, like as a kid, that let's say that this thing is not that serious, then why would I have to be more careful doing this than somebody else? And that's personally because of, let's say, media, right? Or what other people's perceive of, what other people think, right? What other people's perspectives of us are. We have to have these conversations. So I feel like that's how it affects me personally in my daily life. And I feel that personally, this starts from a young age, right? Just talking about children, right? And as much as media bias is in news, and we see it all over the news, it's also found in cartoons. And this is something really, really interesting that I found about cartoons. And I would never think that there would be racial bias or even media bias in cartoons, because you may think this is just an innocent show that kids watch on a daily basis, right? But it all starts from a young age, right? And how things in media are being presented to us. So after doing some research and coming across this article by Atlantic, by an associate professor that studies child and human development at Tufts University, he claims that foreign accents and non-standard dialects were being used to voice all the bad characters, right? So basically what he was claiming was that there was a correlation between characters and character traits and their accents. So I didn't personally notice this, but if you really think about it, the bad guy or the villain in every single cartoon show always had an accent, right? And they were the bad guy. And the good guy always had a British or a specific accent, right? That wasn't American or British. But for example, The Lion King. I know everybody watched The Lion King. I've watched The Lion King. If you haven't watched The Lion King, then you've probably been living under a rock. But we all see the hyenas, right? Scar's minions. And the hyenas are people that we always hated, right? They were the bad guys. They were the villains. Nobody liked the hyenas. They lived in a dirty area and etc. But they all spoke, if you really realize, they spoke in an African-American English accent or an English with a Spanish accent, right? And you may think, okay, what's the problem with that? Or maybe I haven't even noticed that until now. But the problem with that is over time, it becomes a repetitive process in cartoon shows where the bad guy speaks in an accent. And what this does as television is a really prominent source for children, right? It's a really prominent source of cultural messaging for children, because before we even go to school, we're watching cartoons, right? So that's where we get all our information from, just at a young age. So these cartoons actually give us a lot of information as children. And what this is doing as a child is it's unconsciously letting us separate people into two categories, right? Making the villain, the bad guy, as the person with an accent, and the good guy sounds like this. So, right, we're teaching our children at a young age that the good guy sounds this and the bad guy sounds like that. The bad guy has the accent. The bad guy is supposed to be different, right? And we start making these categories of like us and not like us and categorizing that even while we don't even notice it. So it really starts, I feel that media bias and racial bias is being exposed to us as just children, right? And it obviously develops over time where we start seeing it in the news and in social media and in ads, and it just keeps growing and growing over time. So I personally want to ask you, have you ever seen this distinction or link between character traits and accents in cartoons?
Yeah, I absolutely have. And I think it applies to villains, like you said, and it also just applies to general stock characters who are like almost exotic. Like, I mean, this might date me, but I think my default is to think of Phineas and Ferb, and then his name escapes me, but the Indian character in that show, who is always like being super nerdy and just like being a very stereotypical, like not accurate portrayal of Indian Americans. And that type of portrayal also just props up these like fetishized versions of immigrants who come to America, and is not an accurate portrayal of how people actually act or what they believe. And it's a huge problem, because then suddenly we're basing our entire awareness of this entire group of people based on an inaccurate representation of a stereotype. And it just goes to impact everything that we do and say and think about them, especially if we don't have any like actual contact with someone from that group in our real lives. And as children, generally we tend to be pretty segregated based on ethnic or racial groups. And especially in the era of COVID, when so many kids have been growing up very isolated and not very social, a lot of what they are perceiving about social interactions and other people and other demographics is informed by these cartoons or even news or other forms of media. And when they're so biased, that creates an enormous problem, because suddenly we're just creating a new generation of people with deep subconscious biases and unaware that they're having very racist beliefs. And I think that this goes back to something that is covered in news. And I know all the media problems is not confined to just news, but I think this example kind of illustrates how media in general can get away with such flagrant overrepresentations or misrepresentations of people. Is that you lead with what bleeds. This is what's taught in top journalism schools. It's what the best newsrooms in the country use, because when you have a story that bleeds, a story that's really just shocking and grabs your attention, that's what gets viewers, and that's what makes the media companies money. So obviously the people who are in charge of what goes on and off the air or what's published in a newspaper are going to go with they're going to lead with the story that bleeds the most, because it'll capture the most attention. And what often bleeds the most is something that creates fear. And we are afraid of the other. So it's very easy to prop up this boogeyman of, dangerous armed black man or criminal racialized person. Just the simple idea that we can be afraid of someone has created this opportunity, and not even intentional, a way of racializing or creating racial stereotypes within media. It's what sells, and propagating that racist trope of the dangerous black man is a very effective way to get viewers and make money. But of course, the human impact of that is what we're talking about, how devastating it is to our beliefs and how we see people and how we interact and can create communities based on that. And so I think it's just a devastating problem to see that so much of what we see and hear and are exposed to is completely biased. And it's so difficult to find an unbiased or even relatively unbiased source or outlet for whatever type of media it is. And I wonder, Adonai, in your life, how has this impacted what people believe or say around you, or like even what the expectations are of you as a Black woman living in a predominantly white suburb?
Personally, for me, I feel like, especially when it comes to high school, right? The main place where we get our information is obviously our phones. Everyone's attached to their phones. So social media in general is basically where they get their information and where these stereotypes really come from, rather than their homes, right? And so because of these stereotypes that they're seeing in media, I do feel those that pressure on me, especially when talking about, let's say, for example, sports media, because I know that's a really big thing when it comes to high school, right? High school sports are a really big thing in high school, and I feel like when it comes to just diversity at my high school and sports, we do not have that much diversity in sports. So if there's someone, a person of color in a sports team, they're going to be really, really, really hyped up, right? And everyone's going to be like, oh, this person's really good. Even if they don't even know their skill, they're automatically going to assume that they're the best person. For example, like personally, I feel like it just comes from the news in general, right? Because there's this distortion of media imagery of Black men in sports in the media. And this is where it's all coming from, and where high school students and just people in general are seeing this, right? And we see how Black men are disproportionately shown, like overrepresented in sports media as athletes and announcers. And just seeing Black men in these positions, and even Black women in general in these positions, we start creating these stereotypes. And these stereotypes have always been there. And they're that Black people are athletic, or they're supposed to be really, really strong, and etc. And they're putting out these stereotypes in media, these stereotypes that has been here for hundreds of years and during slavery, and putting this like dehumanizing aspect on them as if they are like an other, as we talked about earlier, and putting that perspective on them. And based off what students see, right, or just youth and people in general see in sports media, they apply that to real life. And that real life is like, it comes with pressure, right? Personally, for me as a Black person in sports, right, to do good, to be that athletic person that we see on the TV, right? To be that amazing athletic person. Even if I'm not even at that level yet, they already put me there. So I'm getting a lot of pressure on me to be at that level, right? So personally for me, I feel that pressure. I feel, obviously I'm speaking for myself, right? But I feel that my brother feels that pressure and etc. But I feel like media does have a really big impact on my daily life when it comes to pressure and putting myself in that position, right? And when it comes to stereotypes in media and etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we got to wrap it up quickly here, but we've covered a lot about why media bias can be really detrimental when we're constantly exposed to it. But I want to touch really briefly on some ways that you can go out of your way to counteract this. One way is, of course, just having this conversation, acknowledging that what we're consuming and the stories we're hearing are biased. And then you can start to see and unpack some of those biases. And when you see it, it doesn't have as much power, because it's when it goes unnoticed and just subconsciously seeps into our psyche that it is really dangerous. So acknowledging it is the first step. And then Adonai, how would we go about finding other sources of media? Do we just look for unbiased sources, or are there like other types of media sources that we can use to sort of counteract this bias?
Mm-hmm. Personally, what I think is, for my opinion on unbiased sources, obviously, because there's a reason why we like pick like what type of news you want to watch, right? Because they tell us what we want to hear, right? I definitely think that's a really important point, and that the solution is acknowledging bias, right? And noticing that you have these biases, and that you should come with an unbiased perspective and try to listen to different stories. But I feel like the other solution is just personally in the news, capturing the missing stories, right? Telling the stories that were not there and that aren't heard of, right? Telling joy stories, telling about those doctors, those dentists, those lawyers that are succeeding, those people of color that are succeeding, just telling the stories of us being human, right? Because that's that's the right perspective to give to others, right? Of us just living our lives and showing that we are human too, right? And we have lives and we're succeeding as well. And we definitely want to show those stories instead of the stories. Obviously, it's really important to show that we do have struggles, but at the same time, we also have stories too. We also have lives that where we are personally succeeding, and showing these stories will allow people to open up their minds and perspectives to see us in a different light, to see that we are also human as well. And I feel like that's a really important part of the solution when it comes to media bias.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for all your thoughts today, Adonai. We had a great discussion, and hopefully this 30-minute show was more easily accessible and more condensed for your viewing pleasure. But if you have any more comments, we would love to hear them because we're always trying to improve the show. So we will put a link to a survey on the website under the events tab for this event. But otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you in August when we will be joined by Denise Soler Cox for a fantastic interview. Mark your calendars because it will be a wonderful, wonderful event. We'll have all the info on the website under joinarc.org/events. And we look forward to seeing you then.
Yep. Thank you.